AMD Ryzen 9 9900X 12-core and Ryzen 7 9700X 8-core CPU benchmarks leak, 11% faster versus 7900X and 10% faster versus 7700X in Cinebench. New benchmarks of AMD's Ryzen 9 9900X 12-core and Ryzen 7 9700X 8-core Zen 5" desktop CPUs have leaked in Cinebench. AMD Ryzen 9 9900X 12-core up to 11% faster versus 7900X and Ryzen 7 9700X 8-core up to 10% faster versus 7700X in new Zen 5" Cinebench benchmark leak. In the latest benchmark leak spree, HXL, at 9550 Pro, has shared the Cinebench R23 performance of the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X and Ryzen 7 9700X Zen 5" desktop CPUs. The performance measured here may have been done at default configurations, but the single-core score might hint at PBO, as we've also seen similar single-core scores with the PBO implementation on previously leaked AMD Ryzen 9 9950X benchmarks. Let's start with the specifications of both chips. AMD Ryzen 7 9700X and Ryzen 5 9600X Zen 5 CPUs tested at both default and PBO configs, 2% uplift in Cyberpunk. The AMD Ryzen 9 9900X 100,000,000,662 CPU is a 12-core and 24-thread variant. This chip has a base clock of 4.4 GHz and a boost clock of up to 5.6 GHz with a 76 MB cache. The interesting thing with this chip is that it has a TDP of 120 watts, much lower than the 170 watts of Ryzen 9 7900X chips. Ryzen 7 9700X 100,000,000,1404 is designed for mainstream audiences and features an 8-core CPU with 16 threads, a base clock of 3.8 GHz, a boost clock of up to 5.5 GHz, 40 MB of cache, 1 CCD with 32 MB L3 plus 8 MB L2, and a low TDP of 65 watts, which is also much lower than the 105 watts TDP featured on its predecessor, the Ryzen 7 7700X. The Ryzen 7 7700X has a 105 watts part, while the AMD Ryzen 7 9700X has a 65 watts part, which is almost half its TDP, and that means that the clocks do take a slight bit of hit, with the base clock being minus 700 MHz slower, but the boost clock is rated at plus 100 MHz. For the 65 watts SKUs, AMD recommends using a premium air cooler for optimal performance, but even with such a low TDP, AMD is making sure that enthusiasts don't miss out on the AUC and tuning features, as the Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 5 chips come with all the goodies as the higher-end Ryzen 9 SKUs based on the Zen 5-core architecture. In terms of single-core performance, the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X Zen 5" CPU scores 2,232 points, while the Ryzen 7 9700X scores 2,280 points. In multi-core scores, the Ryzen 9 9900X scores 32,216 points, while the Ryzen 7 9700X scores 21,533 points. Following is how the performance stacks up against the rest of the current gen offerings. In multi-core, the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X scores an 11% lead over the Ryzen 9 7900X, while the Ryzen 7 9700X scores a 10% lead over the Ryzen 7 7700X. The Ryzen 9 9900X ends up 9% slower than the Intel Core i7-14700K, while the Ryzen 7 9700X ends up minus 13% slower than the Intel Core i5-14600K. It looks like the single-core performance of the new Zen 5 architecture is strong, with the 9900X being 11% ahead of its predecessor and the Ryzen 7 9700X being 14% ahead of its predecessor. Both of these CPUs also offer faster single-core performance than the Intel offerings. If these results were done at default TDPs, then we can expect up to 16% better performance on the AMD Ryzen 9 9900X and up to 11% faster performance on the AMD Ryzen 7 9700X with PBO enabled. By default, these chips should also consume lower power and run much cooler than the last Gen Zen 4 offerings, so that's a plus if you don't find the PBO option to be much useful to you. AMD's Ryzen 9000 Zen 5" desktop CPUs will be launching in two waves, first on the 8th of August, Ryzen 5 9600X, Ryzen 7 9700X, and the second on the 15th of August, Ryzen 9 9900X, Ryzen 9 9950X.